Since the first time a motorcycle flew past a cheering crowd of amazed onlookers and powered through a checkered flag, average people like you and I have longed to go fast too. We idolize these skilled and daring figures, and some of us can't help but imagine what it would be like to be in their boots. More than anything, we wonder what it would be like to ride a machine like that. Today, we as the general motorcycle public have become immune to seeing what are essentially full-blown race bikes just cruising around public roads. For the price of a decent-sized tiny house, you can have yourself a lightweight, 200-plus horsepower fire-breathing leader bike featuring much of the technology present on that company's flagship Grand Prix machine, including things like winglets, because you're definitely going to need that front-end downforce and stability as you lane split through LA traffic at 40 miles per hour. If you have stupid money, you could even justify getting a limited edition $100,000+ bike from many of the manufacturers, and that motorcycle will be as close as you're going to get to a full-blown MotoGP bike. Now, sorry to disappoint you though, it's still not even close to what a MotoGP bike is. But this ability to purchase a race bike for the road, it wasn't always this way. As much as a CB750 may have felt like a race bike to the average rider in its day, it was nothing compared to what Honda was actually capable of in terms of performance. Throughout history, motorcycle companies have always depended on their racing success not only to bring in sales and build their image, but also to learn and to develop new technology for their production motorcycles. I've talked at length in other videos about how, especially the major Japanese manufacturers, have used their race programs to develop their production two-stroke and four-stroke technology. Of course, at this point we can include any manufacturer that's in racing, but they were really the companies that pursued this through the 60s and 70s and onward. Those production bikes didn't necessarily rev as high or produce as much power, but there's a sense in which you as a company just kind of learn what works and what doesn't work when you're really pushing the boundaries of what you can produce for a motorcycle. But through the 60s and 70s, there was a very clear distinction between what these companies were developing for on the track and what was made available to the average rider. Now, there are instances throughout all of history where manufacturers have essentially sold race bikes to privateers who were wishing to race, and even back in the early days of racing, there were companies who essentially only made race bikes. Even a motorcycle like a BSA Gold Star in its time was essentially a production race bike. But this notion of taking a successful Grand Prix machine and essentially making a production replica of that machine for the general public, prior to the motorcycle that we're looking at today, that was not really a business model that manufacturers had really went for. Now, if you guys want to learn more about this motorcycle that we're talking about today and its history and its technical details, check out this book by Enrico Bermano. I'll link it in the description below, and that book has been a really great resource for this video. Sometimes I read books for videos, and often they're absolutely massive and very technical and boring. This was a great, short, simple overview, and I definitely recommend it. Early on in their racing endeavors, Yamaha decided to focus on two-stroke technology. Though only successful in the smaller classes initially, as time went on, two-strokes came to dominate all classes of Grand Prix motorcycle racing, and much of this was sort of spearheaded by Yamaha and also, of course, by Suzuki. And finally, that included the prestigious 500cc class. Yamaha took their first Premier Class title in 1975 with their inline-4 two-stroke race bike known as the YZR 500. That also happened to be the first year that any two-stroke had won the class over the high-revving four-strokes. By the 1980s, Yamaha was utterly dominating the 500cc class, thanks not only to the incredible YZR 500 and how they developed that bike, but also thanks to the skills of riders like Kenny Roberts, who won in 78, 79, and 80. But Suzuki's RD500 was back on top in 1981 and 82 with their new Square 4 or U-configured two-stroke race bike. At this point, Yamaha was kind of hitting a wall with their inline-4 configuration, finding it impossible to get any more power out of this engine. So despite considering a V4 setup at this time, they decided to go with the Square setup as well. Now, this time period was really the wild, wild west for Grand Prix racing, and Yamaha could not afford to go all in on radical new setups like, for example, Honda did in the early 80s, for fear of really being left in the dust, or I guess left in the smoke. This square version of the YZR500 was still a fantastic motorcycle, it was still competitive, but it was not enough to take down Suzuki. But in the background, Yamaha was slowly developing that V4 two-stroke. The benefits were clear. It would be simpler as a configuration. It would also potentially reduce the width of the bike down to being about as wide as the 250 class, but it would still have massive power. And of course, we know there's all sorts of other benefits to a V4 configuration. In 1982, the bike made its debut, the OW61. With Kenny Roberts aboard, the bike appeared to really be a real contender, despite not taking the title due mainly to the fact that it came mid-season. In '83, the V4 was making 140 brake horsepower, and that year Roberts duked it out with Honda's Freddie Spencer, and in the end Yamaha would take second place by just 2 points. So that same year in '83, Yamaha decided to bring this radical new kind of sport bike, this V4 two-stroke racebike, to the production side in the form of a replica racebike called the RD500LC. It had many different names, but that's the one I'm going to use in this video, depending on what part of the world you were in. Unveiled initially at the Tokyo Motor Show, this was a motorcycle that looked basically the same as Yamaha's 500cc Grand Prix bike, except with a headlight and turn signals. It was a two-stroke, and it said V4, but was it the same motorcycle as the insane Grand Prix machine known as the YZR500? The goal of the RD500LC was to sort of bring together the two worlds, the world of road riding and track riding, but in a package that was truly usable for the street. If you got your RD500LC in Japan, where in its highest form it was known as the RZV500R, you got a road-going motorcycle with a full aluminum frame mimicking in pretty much every respect the lightweight frame of the YZR500. Here in the States and in Europe, we got a silver-painted steel frame. In terms of the Japanese version, the engine was restricted down to 64 horsepower, but that bike had massive weight savings over the other versions with that aluminum frame. The European and Canadian version made just under 90 horsepower, and it had a different paint scheme. It wasn't technically brought to the US due to emissions laws, but many of them were brought over from Canada. The weight was incredibly low for a bike making around 90 horsepower, just 413 pounds dry. This is due to weight savings at every level. In that sense, Yamaha really did treat this bike like a Grand Prix machine. The approach was pretty much the same. This approach, even to Grand Prix motorcycle design, was somewhat new, an obsession with every single material used for every single part of the bike. And that's a trend that has really stuck around, and for good reason. You know, you can save lots of weight if you make everything of the highest quality and the lightest and the best materials. So this bike had things like cast alloy wheels and alloy castings for the engine with magnesium covers and aluminum mufflers. Even the Kickstarter was made of forged aluminum. This was really high-tech stuff for 1983. And when you look at motorcycles from just a couple years prior to this, you see why the 80s was such an important time for innovations and for technology. And this bike was a massive part in that push to make motorcycles more high-tech. At the heart of the bike, though, is that 50-degree liquid-cooled V4 two-stroke engine, the only engine of its kind in production at this time. This Australian brochure does a really good job at getting at the heart of what this engine and this bike was all about. It says, even if you're not racing, your pulse will be. If Yamaha's newest entry to the two-stroke sport class looks familiar, don't be surprised. The RZ500 is a true replica of Kenny Roberts' YZR500, 6-time Grand Prix winner in the 1983 World Championship Series. A road-going supersport machine that firmly plants Yamaha at the top of two-stroke construction. The RZ's compact, lightweight V4 two-stroke engine is simply the most powerful motor ever produced in its class, gifted with performance capabilities of rivals twice its size. Predictable, precise handling comes from the race-bred chassis with monocross rear suspension and front forks with anti-dive. Liquid-cooled 492cc V4 two-stroke power produces outstanding horsepower combined with an unprecedented power band thanks to electronically controlled Yamaha power valve system. 4 centrally mounted 26mm carburetors supply the 50-degree V4 through reed valve torque induction system. And it goes on to essentially talk up how high-tech and how performance-oriented this motorcycle is. At this time, Yamaha's YZR500, or OW70, that's the actual race version of this bike, that bike was making about 140 brake horsepower. Of course, this motorcycle was nowhere near that. 100 or so more pounds and about 50 less horsepower. Still, it was one of the fastest motorcycles that money could buy in the early to mid 80s, and it was a rideable street motorcycle. But when you read this brochure, you get a sense that Yamaha was really just way ahead of their time with this motorcycle. The RD500LC was produced and promoted almost exactly like modern leader bikes are today, even if the end result was nowhere near what the racers had. Again, pretty much like today. This bike was loaded with technology though. Another interesting feature that was mentioned, and really this is excellently explained in Enrico Bermano's book, is YPVS, that is the Yamaha Power Valve System. This was first designed and introduced in the mid-70s, and its primary purpose had more to do with reducing exhaust pollution. However, Yamaha found that this system could also optimize how the two-stroke engine creates power and torque, and they utilized it on Kenny Roberts' Grand Prix dominating race bikes through the 70s. When people say things like, two strokes make power everywhere, though this is true to some extent, double the power strokes, and sure we think of high-revving four strokes in racing as really only making power at the top end, two strokes still have the same problem. When the height of the exhaust port is increased, power goes up through freer revving, but with this, the torque is also pulled up into the rev range. YPVS essentially controls the exhaust port's height and duration, optimizing the engine's power output across a range of RPMs. This innovation, in part, is what gives these high-performance two-strokes that feeling of having both massive torque and massive horsepower somewhat on tap for the rider everywhere. And from its introduction in the 70s to the late 90s, that is this YPVS, Yamaha would figure out how to take their two-stroke race bikes from around 80 horsepower at 10,000 RPM up to 180 horsepower at 12,000 RPM. Improvements to the YPVS system, coupled with obvious benefits of a V4 configuration, we would see the new YZR500 race bike take the 500cc title in '84, but on the production side, this was really high-tech stuff to have on a motorcycle, and it was pretty incredible to see it available here on the production RD500LC. Now, despite not being the most powerful motorcycle available at this time, this was the closest thing that you could get to a race bike at its release. Even when you calculate the numbers, 175 brake horsepower per liter is still pretty competitive today. This was a 500. This wasn't like an 1100. Despite its high price tag, 2,999 British pounds at the time, which is about the same price as a new Katana, and comparable to just about 10,000 pounds today, which is not too crazy, honestly. Despite it also costing more than a Kawasaki GPZ 1100, this bike sold out really quick right away. But in the end, through its short lifetime, total worldwide sales would only reach about 10,000 units. Though we could point to the ever-tightening emissions regulations as the reason for the death of bikes like the Yamaha RD500LC, and certainly that was a factor. Four-stroke sport bike development is, in my opinion, the main culprit. And I guess you could say we'd never have gotten that four-stroke development without the pressure from regulations to pursue solely four-stroke technology, but that's another topic altogether. Regardless, when you put this in context, it kind of makes sense. Shortly before the release of the RD500LC, the Kawasaki GPZ 900R made its debut, and just a few months after the release of the RD500LC, the iconic Suzuki GSXR 750 would be unveiled to the world. And as much as it may be cool to have something close to what those wonderful Grand Prix racers ride, ultimately these bigger four-stroke sport bikes would just prove to be much better platforms for the road and for, the average person who wants to take their bike onto the track. And in terms of performance, something like a GSXR 750 actually did make comparable power to a 500cc two-stroke race bike at this time. Of course, it's bigger and a bit heavier, but you get the point. Making a two-stroke road-going full-blown 500cc race bike was not only not possible, it just didn't fully make sense at this time. From the RD500LC on, as two-strokes continued to be the configuration of choice for racing, we would see that divide come back, the divide between what was available on the production side for high-performance motorcycles and what was considered the fastest motorcycle available for the track. In the end, this model would live a short, about 2-year life. And though it was the first of its kind in a company attempting to bring as much race technology and performance to the street, it was also the last of its kind in a sense as a road-going, high-performance, two-stroke sport bike. Nothing like it existed prior, and honestly, nothing like it would come afterwards. Okay, I'll admit I am actually ignoring another motorcycle, though it is true that the RD500 was the first of its kind. In all reality, the last and arguably best of this breed of two-stroke replica race bike production bikes was the Suzuki RG500 Gamma. See, that bike took what Yamaha claimed it was doing in building a race replica, and they actually did it. And when you look at the specs of this bike, just the specs, you can see that the RG Gamma was much closer to an actual 500cc two-stroke Grand Prix machine than what the Yamaha was. But even as amazing as that motorcycle was in its own right, neither of these bikes would live on beyond just a few years. Regardless, you get the sense that owning and riding one of these motorcycles is unlike anything you can experience on two wheels. Enrico Bermano, the author I mentioned earlier, described what the RD500LC is like as he owns one, and this is what he says. He says, riding slowly at first to warm the engine up, it is immediately apparent that this bike is blessed with perfect balance. The only intrusion is just a little vibration coming from the final transmission above 5,000 RPM, which never becomes annoying due to the well-designed counterbalance shaft. He says the sporty riding position demanded by the RZ500 achieves a good balance between comfort and an aggressive forward-reaching racer stance. Once 7,000 RPM is exceeded, the bike's personality changes, the performance suddenly coming alive as the machine gets well and truly into its power band. With the rider urging the machine on, it will take a very short time before he finds himself far exceeding posted speed limits, accompanied by the wail of the engine as it approaches 10,000 RPM. Riding at this level is both mentally and physically demanding, but this is the natural habitat for a 500cc GP replica. It will certainly thrill the rider with its effortless speed and acceleration. He says, nowadays riding a large capacity two-stroke in a world surrounded by high-tech four-strokes requires a different approach from the owner. The sudden and violent power delivery coupled with knife-edge handling demand maximum attention at all times from the rider should the RZ500 be his weapon of choice to take on all contenders. Even riding around town becomes a unique experience, and it is necessary to occasionally open it up to clean the spark plugs. In the end, it's hard to deny that motorcycles that are farther rather than closer to what we see in Grand Prix racing actually prove to be the best for sporty road riding for pretty much all motorcyclists. Even many very skilled, talented riders will tell you that something like an R7 is much better than even an R6 or an R1 for pretty much anything you can do on the road. Regardless, it's motorcycles like this that paved the way for the future. And it's endeavors like this, like what Yamaha did, that really helped keep Yamaha as a company on the cutting edge of motorcycle tech and development. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next video, and as always, ride safe.